Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 49 of Days Gone By, the review series for the classic cars and some vintage cars of Gran Turismo. Not that many in the case of vintage, but we work with what we've got. Now this particular vehicle is of course an older Japanese model, the original shape Toyota Celica, and I think overall this may be my preferred version of the Celica. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's my favourite, because I'm not really a Celica fan in general, but of the Celicas which we have, this would probably be my chosen one for just the sake of driving, rather than necessarily racing it. If, though, you're talking more about performance, well then I'd probably be more inclined towards the ST185 in all-wheel drive RC spec, because it's just a great performance car. And if you're talking straight line performance, obviously it's the ST205. This particular model though is where it all began, and it's totally different than the newer Celicas. Any of the Celicas basically from the 80s onwards are totally different to this vehicle. Now that's not surprising. Many Japanese cars have complete changes from their initial production run to today, especially when you consider vehicles like the Celica, and also especially the Skyline. That totally changed over the years, going from rear-wheel drive to all-wheel drive, becoming bigger and bigger over the years, with GTRs of various shapes, sizes, powers, etc. This particular version, though, kind of makes a bigger swap than the Skylines did, because the Skylines have always kept one thing intact, and that is that they are, at heart, motorsport machines. The Celica, on the other hand, kind of changed in that regard, because this original Celica doesn't really have the same kind of feel that the Celicas down the line would come to have. For instance, the ST165, ST185 and ST205 are all very rally-developed, rally-bred vehicles. This car has nothing to do with rallying, it doesn't even have an inclination to go on the dirt, it's got nothing to do with that. And the newer Celica, the ZZT231, that again is totally different. So one of the things that I do like, or rather admire, about the Celica line is that they've actually managed to keep it quite varied. The car isn't overly specialised. It's always been a sports vehicle, a sports coupe, but beyond that, it can kind of change its purpose quite a bit, depending on which model you choose. Now this original, I would say, is probably the most collectible Celica that we currently have on the game, at least for me personally. And as a collector's piece, it's a pretty good beginner's classic. It's a vehicle which doesn't require much skill to drive quickly. It's a very forgiving car, it's a very easy car to drive, it's not overly large even, and it's not overly powerful either, even when tuned. It's also light, and above all, it's cheap. Very cheap. Surprisingly cheap, in fact, given how historically significant this car is. It only has a price of just under 24,000 credits, which is kind of dirt cheap, given how nice a car this is. Now, of course, it's not a premium, and that's kind of a shame, but still, it's a nice car nonetheless. So the question is, for that 24 grand, what does the original Celica have to offer? Because although you see some Celica fans using it, you don't see that many people using these. At least for me personally, I never see people using these cars online. I'm sure it has its fans, but it just doesn't get that much exposure, at least in the lobbies that I've been in. So what do you get? Well, as the name suggests, the 1600 GT, you get a 1600 or 1.6 litre turbo engine, in fully tuned form at least, and it is a rear-wheel drive car. And in some ways, this vehicle kind of reminds me of, in some ways, the Japanese equivalent of something like a 65 Mustang. It's got that kind of small, classic muscle car look to it, even though, of course, it's not a muscle car, but almost like Japan's equivalent of a muscle car, at least visually. And I'm sure there are people who would disagree with that, and I'm by no means a Celica aficionado, but that's the impression that I get from the visuals of the vehicle. What, though, about performance? Well, that 1.6 engine, as I kind of alluded to earlier, isn't the most powerful engine around. You're looking at 263 horsepower, fully tuned, just under 200 pound-feet of torque, and the car only weighs 826 kilos, with of course the full weight loss package. So even though it doesn't have a huge amount of power, not much more than something like, for instance, a Prince Skyline, which is one of my personal favourite classics in the game, but whereas the Prince Skyline also weighs over 1100 kilos, which kind of hurts it, this car doesn't. It's much lighter than that, and in fact this is lighter than many other older classics by around 100 to 200 kilos. 826 kilos is really good, and as a result of that, even though the power isn't ridiculously high, you are still looking at 318 horsepower per tonne, which is pretty good, and thankfully the PP is not ridiculously high either at 474. Perhaps a tiny bit too high, but not ridiculously. I would say this feels more like a 469 PP vehicle, 468, something like that, because although yes, it is light and the power for that level is pretty good, it's not necessarily powerful or, even more importantly, fast enough to really justify that PP level, at least for me. Now, speaking of that performance, what can you expect? Is it worth buying for that 24 grand? Can it be like an Integra or a GSX-R4 or a Dome Zero, a good PP specific vehicle, maybe for seasonals, time trials, online racing even, career mode? Well, to some degree, yes, I would say it can. The fact that it's a small light classic, but still a rear-wheel drive sports coupe, gives you a nice blend of the advantages of both worlds, because typically, classic rear-wheel drive cars tend to be bigger and heavier. This one isn't. It's lighter, much lighter. In fact, it's as light as something which would typically be a small front-wheel drive classic, and that's a great mix to have. All of the advantages of both worlds, basically. And as a result of that, it doesn't need a ridiculous amount of power. So overall, although this thing isn't going to dominate every track you go on at any PP level, it's certainly quick enough to be useful, and it's just a really nice car. So that's it overall for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.